Hello, women's literature class. Today we're going to talk about Edna St. Vincent Millay. She is our first writer from the modern and contemporary time period. Edna St. Vincent Millay was writing during the capital M modern period and lived and wrote all the way until modern sort of switches into postmodern. I wanted to give you some background information about her first because she was such an interesting person. Her parents were divorced, which was starting to become a little bit more usual, but was still kind of odd at this time. She had two sisters, and her mother and her sisters, they were all very, very poor, but her mother would travel around with just a suitcase full of the classics like Shakespeare and Dante. So poetry was always highly valued in her family. When she grew up and came of age, she openly dated both men and women. Lesbianism obviously has existed for all of human history, but it wasn't really out and part of society to such a degree as it started to be during the modern period. And so Edna St. Vincent Millay was one of these very open women who didn't hide her sexuality. Ultimately, she did marry a man, and they had a very interesting relationship. So he supported her so much, and he called himself openly a feminist, and he supported her writing so much that they reversed roles, and he kind of carried out all of the domestic tasks while she pursued life as a writer. And so she really supported him financially. Both of them also had open relationships with other people while they were together. So they both had sort of, I guess we would call them affairs, although they were not in secret. And many of Millay's affairs were with famous other writers and led to her writing lots of pieces of her own. In 1923, she won the Pulitzer Prize. She was only the third woman ever to win one, and she was highly esteemed by many poets of the day. She did suffer her whole life with depression, which we'll see reflected in some of her poetry coming up. So the first poem that I chose for you by Edna St. Vincent Millay was Spring. This is kind of an unusual poem for her because most of her poems are written very strictly in rhyme and meter. So most of her poems have kind of a sing-song quality. Every line is the same amount of beats, and they rhyme and that kind of thing. And this poem is what we would call free verse. So you can see the lines are very irregular lengths. They don't rhyme. They don't have any kind of pattern. And so after we finish talking about the poem, maybe you'll see how that relates to the subject matter of the poem. So she's going to start out this poem, Spring, with what's called an apostrophe. That's different than the apostrophe you put in like it's. In poetry, when we say apostrophe, what we mean is directly addressing something that's not real or not physically in a poem. So she begins Spring by directly addressing the month of April. So she says, "To what purpose, April, do you return again? Beauty is not enough. You can no longer quiet me with the redness of little leaves opening stickily. I know what I know." So she's saying, April, why have you come back? It's not good enough just to say, well, I came back to be pretty and make flowers. That's not enough because I know better now. So she's kind of telling April directly, I've seen through you. I know that this is just a show. The sun is hot on my neck as I observe the spikes of crocus. The smell of the earth is good. So notice how she's kind of describing these flowers. So she says, the sun is hot on my neck as I observe the spikes of crocus. So those images are sort of unpleasant, what we would normally think of as being beautiful spring day with new flowers. We have the spikes of crocus. So there's kind of almost a sinister quality to it. She says, it is apparent that there is no death. So why would she say that? Of course there's death. But of course she's talking about spring when new things are growing and blooming. And so she's saying, yeah, I get it, April. You come and you resurrect life over again. Fine, whatever. So she's kind of being cynical about that whole spring bringing new life thing. But what does that signify? Not only underground are the brains of men eaten by maggots. So she's suggesting that also above ground, men's brains are also being eaten by maggots. So she's kind of like cynical and unhappy with the people she knows or the society she lives in. She feels like the people she lives around also have their brains eaten by maggots, just like the underground men. Life in itself is nothing, an empty cup, a flight of uncarpeted stairs. So here we have a metaphor. She's equating life with an empty cup and a flight of uncarpeted stairs. So an empty cup maybe is a little bit clearer. So if you think about somebody who is unhappy with life, they're depressed, they're not really feeling inspired, an empty cup represents life to them. It's just like a kind of a worn out thing that's outlived its usefulness. The flight of uncarpeted stairs is really a cool image, but it may not be quite as linear or clear. But if you think about like stairs that used to have carpet on them and it's been like ripped up and just how bare and ugly that might look, that's kind of what she's saying about life. Finally, she says, "It is not enough that yearly down this hill April comes like an idiot, babbling and strewing flowers." Right, so she's directly saying April, she kind of is personifying April almost like someone who is like mentally handicapped or slow or stupid. So April is just like this idiot creature who is doing its job, just running downhill and throwing flowers everywhere. And to her, being so deep in her sadness, it really just doesn't seem to fit. It seems useless. Sure, the earth can start over every year, but we can't. Humans can't. So she's feeling, this is a poem of great depression. And so I mentioned before we started talking about the poem that it is in that kind of free verse form, kind of irregular, and that was unusual for her. And to me, I feel like that kind of reflects her depression. The poem is all over the place. It's very irregular. We have lines that are really long. We have lines that are only one word. And so I think that kind of reflects the chaos that was going on in her mind. This poem is much more common in terms of what Edna St. Vincent Millay usually wrote. So this poem is called a sonnet. A sonnet was a verse form invented during the Renaissance, and it usually has 14 lines, which this one does. This is a kind of sonnet called an Italian sonnet, meaning that it has an 8-line first stanza, we call that an octave, and a sestet for the second stanza, or a 6-line stanza. Usually between the 8-line stanza and the 6-line stanza, there's some kind of like resolution or some kind of shift in thinking. We call that the volta. So after we read the poem, we'll see if we can find a shift where the two stanzas break apart. So you'll notice that there is a very rigid meter or rhythm, and that the rhyme scheme is also very regular. So you have why, lane, rain, sigh, reply, pain, again, cry, etc. So this is, again, much more typical of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Now, I gave you this poem because this is the first time, really, in history that women are having these very open sexual relationships with whoever they want to, with really not so many consequences. So really that Madonna whore complex is maybe starting to disintegrate, and women, like men have always been able to, can start to kind of follow their passions and do what they like. So let's read this. "What lips my lips have kissed, and where, and why, I have forgotten. And what arms have lain under my head till morning." So she says, I can't even remember all of the people that I have kissed and lain with. I've forgotten them all, or rather, I can't remember them all. "But the rain is full of ghosts tonight, that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply." So this particular night, the way that it's raining outside is starting to make her remember some of them. Listen, they're ghosts almost in the rain. "And in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry." So she's starting to feel kind of a melancholy longing for even these boys she can't remember that she was with. But she's kind of longing to be young again and to go back and to have those kinds of intimacies. Now notice, here's our volta. "Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before, So she is here comparing herself to a tree in wintertime, right? So in the winter, the tree doesn't know, he doesn't remember every single bird that ever sat on his branches and sang, but it does know that its boughs are suddenly empty and quiet, and it misses those birds. So that's how she's feeling right now and in the winter of her life, right? So winter in poetry often represents the kind of coming into old age or sort of an ending. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. So this is not necessarily a love poem where she's missing a particular man or a particular relationship. It's more that she's missing that summer in her life, that time where she was young and had those passions, and she knows that in her it sings no more, right? So again, those birds, we have that word sing that relates back to the birds on the tree in winter, right? So there's no more singing on her branches, if you will. So this is a really lovely poem that the reason I chose it is because if we were to see a poem like this 100 years ago, it wouldn't shock us if a man wrote it, right? Sure, a man could say, I'm getting older now and I miss all the little girls I used to kind of flit with. But for a woman to write a poem like this, yeah, like I miss being young and having affairs with men. I mean, that's a normal feeling, isn't it? When you're kind of getting older and you're missing the kind of young, fun days where you went on dates and you fooled around and all that kind of stuff. But for a woman to have those feelings at this time is revolutionary, and she's admitting it openly because it's a natural human feeling. So I think this is a really fantastic poem, not only in its construction, but also because of the fact that a woman wrote it, and we're seeing kind of finally a whole human picture of a woman. I did mention the volta, which is that gap between the stanzas. So just notice that the first stanza is all about the lads, we'll say, that she's remembering, kind of their ghosts tapping in the rain. And then when we get the break, after that, that's when her real sadness comes in. This is where we start to have that talk about winter and summer. So that volta kind of serves for like a hinge and a door, if you will. I hope that you enjoyed reading Edna St. Vincent Millay, and I would be happy to recommend some more poems by her if you like her. Let me know if you have any questions.